in just a couple of minutes, but I will say that we are a class behind almost exactly. So we're going to try our very best to remedy that tonight. So that doesn't mean I don't want your comments. It just means I might not say much about them, and I'll just move right on. So.
And you believe that, right?
Yeah. No, sometimes people just put one out there I can't help but say something about it. And I think we probably will. I don't want to miss over anything that somebody has a question about, so don't let us do that. But I think we will do a little bit more summarizing, at least in chapters 7 and 8. When it comes to the flood, chapter 6 lays out what's going to happen pretty well, and then 7 and 8 will finish it up. But I don't want to overlook anything that somebody has a question about. Somebody was telling me the other day that they were in a Bible class, and somebody held their Bible up, and they said, we didn't rent these from the library. We don't have to take them back anytime. We can just take as long as we want. And that's true unless you're working on a Lonnie Oldag schedule. And then that's not true. I can't take as long as I want. I told him Sunday night he's going to have to cover the second half of Genesis next quarter because I wasn't going to get anywhere. But we're going to try. All right. You want to lead us in?
Well, we may, go with the mode that Larson's as far as chapter content. So chapter 1, let's go back and rehash. Chapter 1, how would we title that? Creation. So that's how I envision chapter 1 as from a panned out prism there. We're seeing things from a distance. The creation of the heavens and the earth. And actually, after God created each thing, what did he say about it? How did he evaluate it? It was good, wasn't it? And when he got to man, what did he say that was a little bit different? Very good. What was very good about it? Made in his image. Exactly. Made in his image. Okay, so chapter 2. How would you characterize chapter 2? Yeah. More, things kind of zoom in. We get a more in-depth study on man. We focus in on man and not so much on the cosmos or the other created beings, but we focus and zero in on man and his relationship with God there. Good. All right, what about chapter 3? Yeah, we see God places man in a garden, and it's a paradise. And God dwells with man there. But God does not want man as God being the great puppet master, and only, man had no other choice but to serve God. So what does he do? What does he place in the garden? To give him free will. Restrictions. Very good. Prohibitions. However you want to characterize that, he does that. And of course, man blows it. Man blows it. So there are consequences to that, and we've discussed those consequences. But the one positive thing, when all looks like is lost, there is a hope, a glimmering hope. And we see down the road that there's going to be someone that is going to bridge this relationship back together that has been lost with the sin. So chapter 4, how would you characterize chapter 4? Yeah. And it's really one-sided, isn't it? Here we have the offspring of Adam and Eve, the two sons, Cain and Abel, and they bring an offering to God. One's accepted, the other one is not. And how does that play out? Not well, especially for Abel. His was accepted, but Cain's was rejected. And Cain just wasn't able to get over it, was he? And took vengeance on his brother. Now, Abel, did he have anything to do with this? Did he have anything to do with Cain being rejected, his offering being rejected? But Cain took it out on him. And here we have the first recorded murder taking place. And so it's interesting. We'll see how things change as we go through tonight's study. But on this occasion, God has Cain to be an outcast, as it were. And so we see Cain and we see the descendants after Cain. And how does that play out? Yeah, they just drift further and further from God, do they not? Larson covered it, I think, last time in 7 generations from Adam. You have Lamech, and then you have him bragging about slaying a man. You know, that we've drifted a long ways from where we started. Good point. Good point. Multiple wives. And that's the first we see of polygamy taking place. But on the other hand, Adam and Eve have another son. What's his name? Seth. And what direction does he take? Yeah, him and his descendants call on the name of the Lord. And so you have this split here. In chapter 5, we have the genealogy of Adam, Seth, and so on until we get to Noah. But as we open chapter 6, we're still seeing that divide take place. And yet that divide that's taken place actually comes back together in a sort of way. What am I describing there? What happens? Yeah, through marriage. You have carnally minded people marrying spiritually minded people. And what happens? Yeah. You know, I listened to the recording last time we came through this, and Larson described 2 people, one on the ground, one standing up. And if they hold their hands out and lock hands, which is easier? Is it easier to pull someone up from the ground or from the person on the ground pulling the upright person down? It's always easier to pull down than it is up. And I think that's what you're seeing right there as chapter 6 opens. And so, what has the world become? What has the people of the world become? Every thought, every intention is wickedness continually. Can you imagine? But what is the saving grace? Noah is the saving grace for all of humanity. I mean, he's it. And thankful for him, we all exist today. Because this man, when talking about somebody standing alone, have you ever worked somewhere or been in an environment where nobody shared your spiritual interest? Everybody is just very carnal, whether they were foul-mouthed or did not respect your position as a Christian. Imagine Noah. How much support, how much spiritual support did he have? I mean, we're here tonight, and why are we here? Are we not here for spiritual encouragement? How much of that did he get? Yeah, he sure did. Yeah, his strength comes exactly from God. That was the encouragement he had. But outwardly, outside forces, there was nothing there to build him up. It was just his relationship with God. Imagine being in that kind of environment where you had zero spiritual support, zero encouragement.
But one thing, it's hard to imagine. Actually, God speaking directly to you and then telling him the whole plan, and then you know that you're actually talking to God. I think it's more overwhelming that we can actually engulf, even up to the time of when, Jesus prayed to the Father and told him, you let this cup pass from me. But he told him, but thy will be done. And Noah is basically doing the same thing to God. He said, I know everything around me is terrible, but I'm going to do exactly what you want me will to do. And he done it.
But Cain had the same opportunity, didn't he? Didn't everybody at this point in time? And yet, where were their hearts? Where were their minds? Yeah, everyone was just focused on evil, on wickedness. That's what I'm saying. Noah didn't have anybody to build him up. We sometimes have, some level of a roller coaster, spiritually speaking. We have highs, we have lows, and hopefully they're not like this. Maybe they're more, like this long way. But where did his spiritual encouragement come from? It had to come only from God. There was no external. He had his immediate family, but there was just nothing there. He did. He had a core. But still, it's only 8 souls. That's a small group. I'm just trying to emphasize that this man, he wasn't he was, his spiritual interests are something for all of us to admire and to point out that, even when there is no external support out there, we still can choose to do right, what is right in the Lord's eyes. And so that brings us basically where we're at. God tells Noah to prepare. He's going to send judgment upon the entire earth. And so Noah begins to make preparations, and he starts building an ark. And God gives him very clear instructions, very exact instructions in the size, what type of material to use, multi-level ark that he's going to build, him and his sons. And so preparations are made. All has been done, and now we're ready for judgment.
Yeah. Going off of what Mr. Gerald said just now, Hebrews 11, verse 7. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this, he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. In what way does Noah building the ark condemn the world? I mean, the world was already condemned, right? So how does Noah building the ark condemn the world? And I think this goes maybe to what Mr. Gerald is saying, maybe some to what Mr. Steve was saying too. What does that show us about the world at the time of Noah?
It was possible to obey God.
It was possible to do right. And so in doing right, in faithfully obeying God, Noah shows there's no excuse, right? I always love it when I have somebody make 100 on one of my tests at school, because then no matter what anybody says, I can say, well, it was possible, right? Now, if everybody fails it, which does happen, then I say, okay, I might need to go back to the drawing board here. But Noah, by doing this, by building the ark, by responding in obedient faith, condemns the world on the one hand. Not because he's telling the world they're going to be lost, though he may have said that, but because he shows he is a prime example of faithfulness being possible. Not perfection, but faithfulness. And he becomes an heir of righteousness by that faith. And so notice that at the end of chapter 6, Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. In chapter 7 and verse 1, then the Lord said to Noah, go into the ark, you and your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. We want to be careful, because we don't want to say that what we do somehow earns God's salvation. But Noah had responded appropriately to what God had done for him, to what God had revealed, and because of that, God showed him special favor. Right? It wasn't completely removed from what Noah had done, the favor and the grace that God had shown to him. And I think that's helpful for us to remember as when we first see the word grace. Do we have the idea here that there just wasn't anything Noah was supposed to do? No, he had done something to find that grace shown to him in the first place, and he had to do something in response to it being shown to him. There wasn't, just this kind of free idea that he didn't have to do anything in response. Now, you notice again in verse 4, Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him, and in particular there with regards to the taking of the animals, 2 of every kind, and then especially the 7 pairs of the animals that were clean. And that would be important, because the clean animals would be able to be used for sacrifices. It doesn't seem to me that yet we're talking about clean in the sense of like in the book of Leviticus, where you've got some animals you can't eat and some animals you can. When God speaks to Noah in chapter 9, he doesn't make any distinction about that, only that they can't eat the blood. But as far as what animals are clean and unclean in this case, I think we must be talking about something that Noah knew and that God knew that Noah knew. But it looks to me like Leviticus is the first time where there's that designation about what animals the Jews could eat and which ones they couldn't specifically. Does that make sense? Okay. Hopefully it does. Any thoughts as we start in chapter 7? Yeah. That's right. Must have. And yeah, that's right. And that's what made it faith, right? It was not that there wasn't evidence, right? There was a God, and God was speaking to it. But it was evidence that you had to be willing to see, and you had to be willing to listen to. And
I think Dad pointed out last class that it had never rained.
Yeah.
They had the dew from the ground that would come up and water things before the flood. And so if a guy's going around saying, he's going to flood the whole earth and open up the sky, or however he was told to tell.
Right.
That would seem pretty far-fetched.
Yeah.
Well, this guy was different anyway, though, wasn't he?
And the other part is, I believe wherever he built the ark, it was right there, probably pretty close to where a lot of the trees was that God actually told him to hew down to build.
Right in the gopher
And,
grove.
but what I'm saying is, it's not up against the ocean or
Right.
any port or nothing. I mean, it's out in this bunch of trees, and he's building this big, huge boat. And they go, look at this crazy fella. He's
Yeah.
building a boat, and he ain't even got it down there by the water. How's he think he's going to get it down there to the water?
Yep. He had a little help. So, yes. Now, when we look at, and again, I think we'll summarize a little bit. There's about 350 days total that's spent on the ark. 40 days where it rains, 150 days the water prevails on the earth, 150 days it recedes, and there's about 40 more days. And from there, Noah's going to leave the ark. But I want you to notice the totality of this. Look at verses 19 and following in chapter 7. To what extent is the earth covered according to Genesis 7? Yes, totally. Yeah, the highest mountains are covered. How effective is God's means of judgment here? Completely effective, right? Everything on the dry land whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground. So it accomplished God's purpose that he had for it back in chapter 6. So the question that comes is, well, was there actually a global flood? Well, Jesus references this, right? And Jesus was the only one of us raised from the dead, so I'll take his word for it. And Jesus, when he references this, is saying that account is true. And because that account is true, it is a preview of judgment that's coming for us. In fact, Peter uses it that way in 2 Peter chapter 3. He said, people say, well, the world's just been going on the same way it always has been. And he says, hold on a second. The world was destroyed by water. The next time, it's going to be a purification or a purging by fire. I think the main point here is that it is effective, it is sufficient to accomplish God's purpose.
I think I heard one time that of all ancient religions, they all have a flood story within them.
Yeah. And it's remarkable. And so you have to think, well, what happened for that story to circulate? Well, the skeptic says, well, they just copied each other. But they go back so far that maybe the question is, maybe there was a true story that all of these are copying from originally. In fact, I don't know if you've ever seen this. You can Google it. The story of the Bible in Chinese characters. Have you ever seen this? It's pretty amazing. They take Chinese characters and they break them down and into their composite parts. And they take their word for boat and their word for eight, and that's their word for really big boat. A boat and eight. And it's like this is thousands of year old language. Like their lamb for sacrifice is like lamb and knife or something like that. And you just think it's really amazing. And when I was little, we were supporting a man who was preaching in Japan, the congregation that I was a part of. And he came and he shared some of that. And he used that when he would talk to people, because Japan and China, if I understand correctly, the written part is pretty much the same, even though the spoken language is different. And he would use that as a way to say, look, even built into your language are these stories from a long, long time ago. So, yeah, there's something to that, that idea that the flood, it's reported all over the world. All right. In chapter 8 and verse 1, but God remembered Noah. What? Did he forget?
Oh, yeah.
If you're Noah, you're on this boat, and God forgot. And, oh, man, I'm glad like me when I was supposed to go to the grocery store. Man, I'm glad I remembered that. I'd have been indignant. No. What does it mean that God remembers Noah here? He's going to fulfill his promises. Tom Hawley has a line. He will say, covenants are made with promises and sustained by memory. And I think that's right. So think about a marriage covenant. A marriage covenant is made with promises and sustained by memory. When it says that God remembered Noah, it's not saying that he forgot. It's saying that he intends to accomplish his covenant. He intends to fulfill his promises. And I think that is helpful there. For example, in Exodus chapter 2, when the children of Israel are in slavery in Egypt, the text will tell us that God remembered his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's not that he forgot. It's that now he recognizes this is the time when I'm going to start fulfilling that purpose that I had a long, long time ago. Okay. Anything you'd like to say through chapter 8? Maybe down to verse 18 for the Gerald? Anything that you would like to say? I know we're skipping over a lot, but
Well, I noticed that it says he'll never do that again.
yes, that's very good. So notice, especially down in verse 21, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of his man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I've done while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So why does God say that he's not going to do this again like this? He gives a because there in verse 21, or a for in my text. For man's sake. He says, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. I think the idea is if God was simply going to flood the world when things got bad enough, it would just go over and over
Perpetually.
and over again. He would just be perpetually flooding.
Yeah.
And so he's going to have a different way of addressing this moving forward. And we're going to see that, particularly as we pick up in chapter 12. But it is God in this case, I think, saying this was a one-time way to address this issue. And we're not going to keep coming back to this as a solution. Okay, so when you think, yeah, go ahead.
Wouldn't the other part of it be, since he's God, knows everything, higher ways and all that, he already know from Adam and Eve that he was going to use Christ to take the power away from the devil and then actually start the church, and then the descendants would actually go to heaven. He already knew that from what they actually said that he's going to burn it up, that the flood was the first time.
Yeah.
The second time it's going to get so bad that it's going to be like the days of Noah. But
yeah,
the second time, I'm going to take it all out.
Yeah.
I'm going to burn up everybody.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we are looking for the world to get as bad as it was in the days of Noah. I assume that there will be lots of faithful people when the Lord finally returns. We have that passage in 1 Thessalonians 4 that says, then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together to meet the Lord in the air. Now, I don't know how many that's going to be, but I do think your point is true that the flood was a preview of what's coming at the end, and that it will be like the days of Noah in certain respects. That is, there's going to be a lot of people who don't think it's going to happen. And that's the point that Jesus makes from it in Matthew 24, speaking in maybe in the short term about the destruction of Jerusalem, but speaking in the long term about the final judgment.
You know, and on this occasion, we have a precedent set here. You know, we have a record to go along with that. So we know exactly how God feels about sin.
That's right.
You know, it hasn't lessened over time. He feels the same today as he did in those days. So there's no need in this thing, you know, as you said, you know, perpetually repeating itself. We've got a one-time record, and God has made it clear on what his position is.
And I wonder if in some ways these early chapters, you know, we're left with a lot of questions from chapters 1 through 11 that we'd love to be able to answer. But I think the point of them is this, is to explain why the world is the way it is, and explain why Christ and that way of saving the world is the only option. Because somebody might say, well, you know, if God just started with 2 people and just made it as basic as possible to follow him, then it would all work out.
They already did that.
No, it wouldn't, right? Already tried that. Well, you know, if he found somebody who was already interested in doing right and just wiped the slate clean and started over with him, then it would work out all right.
I already did that.
Well, what if, and as we get into chapter 12 with Abraham and his family, well, what if you just got one family of people and all you worried about was them doing right? And just
You kind of isolated them and, you know, kept them to themselves.
Make their own community. You give them their own land. You give them laws to set them apart from it. Then it will work. And that didn't work either. And so I think as we go through the Old Testament, we're going to find that the only solution is to have a covenant people who enter the covenant by their own free will and who have a means of forgiveness, because we desperately need that. And so anyway, all that is to say is I think these early chapters, they're not always intended to answer all our questions that we might like, even though we still like to ask them. But they are intended to show us how we got where we are and why Christ is the only solution. There's not another way to figure this out. And yeah, go ahead.
In reference to about the days of Noah,
Yes.
in Matthew 24:36 through 39, but of that day and the hour no man knoweth, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father. But as the day of Noah were, so shall be the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days there were before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day of Noah entered the ark. And they knew not until the flood came and took them away. So shall be the coming of the Son of Man. So it'll be similar right before Noah went into the ark is when Christ will come.
Yes, in that they didn't anticipate it coming. I think that they were about their daily business, and then boom, it came. All right. I want you to think about the world. The reason I'm going to pause here for just a second because I want to talk about 1 Peter 3:20-21. The like figure whereunto baptism doth also. So he talks about the flood in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved. And then in verse 21 he says, the like figure, or corresponding to that, baptism now saves you. Not the putting away the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God by the power of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. What did the flood do to the world? It destroyed it in one sense. But did it annihilate it? Did it cease to exist completely? No. It was the same world, but washed. The same world, but cleansed. The same world, but maybe we would say renewed or rejuvenated. Peter says that's what baptism is, right? When we go down in the grave, in the watery grave, and we come out, are we the same person? Kinda. We're still like, I'm still Larson. But when I come up, that old world, that old person has been washed. And the new person that's alive is rejuvenated, is renewed, it's a new birth. And so I think that's the sense in which Peter is talking about it being, it's taking something that's old and not annihilating it, not completely destroying it, but washing it and making it new and fitting it for God to accomplish His purpose in it. And I think that's the illustration that Peter is using there in 1 Peter chapter 3. Any thoughts through the end of 8? I know we skimmed over that. I don't want to miss anything that you think we ought to know.
Well, I think it's in that comparison, Noah, the flood, and us, the baptism, it separated us from our sin.
Yes, that's right.
And just as it did with Noah, it separated him from all wicked people.
Very good.
So it was judgment and yet salvation.
Judgment and salvation. And maybe there's a sense in which, in us being baptized, it does condemn the world. Right? Not that we're better, but it does show that God's instructions are clear and that they can be followed. And that people who reject it not because God wasn't clear, but because they have something else in mind. And I think that's helpful. All right, when we come to chapter 9, I want you to look at those first couple of verses and think about what they remind you of and what do you think that means for where they show up in the text. Chapter 9, first few verses.
It's basically what was actually told to Adam and Eve.
That's exactly right. It's basically what was told to Adam and Eve with a few emendations. But what do you think that means? What is God saying by telling this to Noah here?
It's your responsibility.
It's your responsibility. What'd you say?
Man's purpose
Man's purpose
is still
is still the same. God still has the intention of blessing people through humanity, blessing the world through humanity. Now, there's some differences here. You've got, it looks like meat being given for food as the first time. I'm not sure that they weren't eating it before, but at least now it looks like maybe there's a license given to that. Maybe there's an allowance for that. But what are they supposed to avoid when they're eating this meat? The blood. I don't know what all to make of that, but he's teaching us a lesson here. There's life in the blood. And he will remind us of that in Leviticus 17. And even in the New Covenant, it's repeated to abstain from blood. And it's because God's teaching a lesson. There's life there. And maybe ultimately pointing towards the sacrificial system. And then even beyond that, pointing to Christ and the efficacy, the sufficiency of his offering. We need to learn a lesson early on, the Scripture says. There's life in the blood. That blood is valuable. And Christ's blood most of all.
And so we have the institution of capital punishment here that's instituted as well. I mean, this is how serious he is about life being in the blood. There is value in life. And so what happens now if a man takes another man's life? Yeah, your life is required. You know, that's what we talked about earlier with Cain. You know, it wasn't at that point in time. He became a vagabond. But from this time forward, we will see that when a life is taken, whether it's by man or beast, you know, it requires life from them. And that's how serious God is about the value of life. Man was created in the image of God, and we are to respect that.
So what does he give as a symbol of reminding us that he will never destroy the earth by water again? The rainbow. Yeah, the rainbow. And the word for bow, he says is the same word for like a bow and arrow. It's used in other places in the Old Testament, talk about bow. And so you almost have a picture of God hanging up his bow, right? I'm not going to use that anymore. I'm not going to use that weapon against the world anymore. And maybe, I think certainly we can see the value in that. You know, that Noah and his descendants, and as they pass that story down to their children, you know, anytime it rained for a couple extra days, you might get worried, is this happening all over again, you know? And it would be that rainbow, perhaps, that had to serve as the reminder, at least for a while, that it's not happening all over again. And it still serves as a reminder of the faithfulness that God makes to his promises. And for Christians, we see, you know, there have been a lot more promises made and kept by God in the time since. And maybe in some way, the rainbow points as a preview to all those, that God, the very first promises he makes, he's keeping. And the most recent promises he's made, he's keeping. And makes us look forward to the ones that have not been fulfilled yet.
You think Noah and his family probably viewed a rainbow a little differently than we do?
Yeah.
Probably.
On the other side of
Since they lived it out,
Yeah.
they witnessed. I'm sure they did.
That's right.
So we ready to move on?
I think we're ready. Now,
Yeah.
that is what, that catches us up to what we're supposed to be covering tonight. so y'all hold on, because we got 20 minutes to cover what we're supposed to cover tonight. No, we'll be okay. We're better caught up than we were.
Yeah. So Noah and his family begin their new life. And what does it say about Noah? Noah, what trade did he take on? Yeah, he became a farmer. And in the process of time, he begins to grow different things. Amongst those things, a vineyard. And of course, from vineyard comes grapes. And through the process of time, I don't know what had been learned up to this point in time, but he has understood that you can make wine from this product. And of course, he takes too much of it at a certain point of time, and what happens? Now, you would think, you know, this is in the privacy of his own, you know, but it still leaves, you know, it leaves an occasion here for his sons, and one son in particular to come in and find him passed out naked, as it appears. And so, what does Ham do with that situation? Yeah, but in what sense? In what way did he tell his brother? Because as we go down through here, we see how this plays out, and there's curse pronounced upon Ham for this. So it wasn't like he was just notifying them of what had taken place. It seems that there was some mockery or something taking place in this. And so, but the other brothers, how did they respond? Did they join in? What did they do? Yeah, but how did they do it? Yeah, you know, yeah, you see the respect they have for their father. Why didn't Ham have that same respect? You know, again, are we starting to see that divide, a little bit of divide here? I don't know. But here's an occasion where the younger takes a different path from the olders, and there's a curse that is pronounced upon him, and more in particular upon his descendants. Look at verse 25. It says, "Cursed be Cain, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." And it goes on to describe how he will be a servant to his brothers in future generations, and we'll see that as that plays out. But it says in verse 28, "After the flood, Noah lived 350 years, and all the days of Noah were 950 years. And as you always say, he died.
He died.
Just as all people of all generations have done. And so we have the end of this era. And Noah, this is somewhat famous for being a childhood story, but what do we learn from these kind of stories as adults? And how many times have we been through this curriculum studying this very same subject, and yet there's a lesson for us each and every time? No matter what our atmosphere is, no matter who we're surrounded by, what our influences are, what are we capable of doing? Yeah, we're capable of being faithful, of making good choices, of serving God, no matter the influence out there. But we also see, of course, what influence can do. A lot easier, again, to pull you down than to pick someone up. So,
any thoughts through chapter 9? So, as we come into chapter 10, and if you have questions about any of that later, feel free to ask, and maybe we can find an answer. You've got the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So I have a map here on my tablet, but I did not bring a slide. When you think about Japheth, most of the nations that descend from Japheth that you would have categorized here would be in what is today Turkey, Greece, that territory. Most of the descendants of Ham would be in Africa and in Canaan and kind of on the western side of the Fertile Crescent. And then most of Shem's descendants, with which we're going to be most concerned in the next couple of chapters, are going to be in Mesopotamia and down in Arabia. Now, you've heard the term Semitic. You've probably heard it anti-Semitic, right? If somebody makes a joke about Jewish people, they are called anti-Semitic. Well, that comes from the word Shem. It's the descendants of Shem. So all of those different groups descend from Shem, including the Jewish people, and we'll trace their line down in chapter 10 or really the end of chapter 11 as much too. So we won't spend a ton of time on Japheth. We won't spend a ton of time on Ham. I will make a point that Ham's son Canaan, where do you think they settle? They settle in the land of Canaan. So those curses that were promised on Canaan, that's going to be fulfilled mostly in the conquest. We're going to see that in chapter. You see where they settle in chapter 10, verses 15 and following. You have all of these different, the Amorites, the Jebusites, the Hivites. When we get to the book of Joshua, you're going to see those names come up again. In fact, is there a little bit of a preview of their kind of character at the end of verse 19? They settled in the direction of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboiim as far as Lasha. Now, I'm sure there were other cities they settled, but the writer goes ahead and Moses tells us they settled in these areas. We know what direction those areas are headed in, and it's not good. And maybe in some ways, Ham is a predecessor in that more so than just in genetic code, but also in how he treats his father shamefully. That it's not going to be the end of that in that family line.
There in 20, it actually also says that the sons of Ham in countries.
Yes.
And in their nations, and then down below it starts naming the ones above that. But I think they're more than just in the Mesopotamian area when they actually spread out abroad. I mean, they could have been down in Africa or wherever.
Yes.
Spread out.
Yeah, they were. That's right. And maybe at the beginning, they're all right there together. I think that's true. And I think chapter 10 is describing where do these nations go really after chapter 11. And let me, I think, pointing to that, just as an example, and I'll stop talking for a second. In verse 25, Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. There is an argument to be made, I think, that this is talking about the continental drift and all that. I think it's more likely that what we're talking about is what happens in chapter 11, that the people of the earth are divided. That's when everybody went to their direction. And so what I'm saying here is chapter 10 is kind of written as a preview of what's going to happen in chapter 11. Like, okay, let's do Japheth's line. Let's do Ham's line. I want to tell you where they're all going to settle. And you say, well, how in the world do they get to all those places? Well, we've got a story for you. Let's tell you chapter 11. But maybe there's more about Shem's line that we should say before then.
All right. Are we ready for chapter 11?
Well, one thing about, sorry, I said I quit talking. Shem, also the father of the children of Eber. That name Eber, have you ever heard Abraham, Isaac, Jacob referred to as the Hebrews? That comes from that name. They were descendants of Eber. So the Shemites would be kind of the broad umbrella term. And then Hebrews would be a little bit narrower. And then Jews would be a little bit narrower. Jewish people would be even narrower than that, right? So you kind of, well, actually it would be, not to be overbearing on this, but it'd be Shemites, Hebrews, Israelites, and then Jewish people was really started to be used of the people who lived in Judea in the southern kingdom, and then it came to apply to all those people. But anyway, now I think we're ready for chapter 11.
Okay. All right. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for the stone and
Benjamin, I think.
bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. So here you have a people. Of course, you see the singularity as far as they have all the same language. There are no diversification of language at this point in time. So they travel from the east and they settle in this land here. And so they decide that they have progressed. They're building structures with brick. They've got the ovens to cook this, and so they can build these structures, these long-lasting structures. And why are they doing all this? What's their purpose? What's driving them to do all this? Yeah, lest they be scattered. I think back to Genesis 9, verse 7, where God said, and you be fruitful and multiply, talking to Noah and his family, increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it. And so here, instruction was given for them to multiply and to, here these people are wanting to settle in one location instead of spread and multiply and cover the whole earth. They're trying to single themselves into one location here and create a name for themselves. What are spiritually minded people? What are their focus? Is it to make a name for themselves? What is their drive?
Their pride is to actually build the tower to God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you see pride.
And actually, I guess their pride to the point that everybody say, well, who is these people that created this tower? But what they said that they didn't want to do is what God's actually going to do to them.
Mm-hmm.
And to contrast that, somebody spiritually is trying to exalt God's name.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, you see them, again, it's about self. It's about us. Where's God in all this? He's not to be seen. He's not to be heard.
So what does God do now before he scatters them? Notice what the text says in verse 5. He comes down. I was reading a children's book, a story of the Bible children's book one time. It said, well, it must not have been all that tall because he had to come down to see it. And I like that. The biggest things humans can build, God still has to come down to see it. He's way up there. But the point is this. God came down to investigate. And I think Genesis is teaching a lesson about God's judgment. When God judged the flood, was that a hair trigger response? No. It had been generations in the works, and he gave 120 years after he finally made the decision. When he comes to bring judgment, and I think this is a judgment of sorts on Babylon, or Babel, when he comes to do that, does he do so without knowing all the facts? No, he comes down and investigates. Now, Genesis is not saying God didn't know what was going on from up there in heaven. What it's telling us is that God made sure. God investigated carefully. He knew what was going on, I think is the point. So when we come to chapter 18, and we're looking at the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah, and remember Abraham asked the question, shall not the God of all the earth, the judge of all the earth, do right? You know what the answer to that is? Yeah, he will do right. Every time, God will do right. And when it came to Sodom and Gomorrah, God did right. And we'll talk more about that when we get there. But we're learning a lesson about God's judgment all the way through the book of Genesis, that it's always fair. It's always done, even in his judgment. He's remembering mercy and further, and more than that. Now,
what you brought up about Sodom and Gomorrah, even when at this point when it said that God came down to see, when God came to Abraham, he actually came to see if what had been told about Sodom and Gomorrah, even though he knew it. He went down and seen it with the angels.
that's right.
And then after he confirmed that it was, after he got Lot out, he confirmed it up.
Well, and you remember Abraham's conversation. What if there's 50? What if there's 40? What if there's 30? What if there's 10, 20? What if there's 10? God says, yeah, even if there's 10. And there weren't 10. So that's showing us. So when God brings judgment, it's not unfair. We may not like it. We may be on the receiving end of it. But Genesis is teaching us that God is going to be fair and just in doing that. So then what does God do? He confuses their language. They speak all the different languages. They're dispersed, and so it becomes known as Babel. And just about every language, I think, has some word that means Babel, and it sounds something like Babel, because it's nonsense talk. Not that they weren't real languages, but they were nonsense talk to the people who couldn't understand them. Now, this Babel is the same that later is Babylon. And so think about what that would mean for Babylon. It would mean that this is the kind of the center of global opposition to God. So in addition to everything else we learn about Babylon in the Old Testament, when you say Babylon in Revelation, that word being used, we know that from the very beginning, this is kind of the center of opposition to God. So you've had Adam and Eve rebel against God. Downward spiral. Whole world except one man in rebellion against God. He cleans it. He cleans the slate. We get back to chapter 11, and who's in rebellion against God? The whole world. The whole world at the end of chapter 11 is in rebellion against God. But God's not giving up. He will not give up on his operation, even though we would have thrown in the towel and destroyed everything. God is going to remain faithful to his plan.
So here, when people collectively come together, what do? They join forces to work against God's will. Yeah. Is today any different?
Unity is not always good.
Where are people more, let's just say, use the conventional term, liberally minded in your cities, where people are grouped together today? When you space people out, what happens? They become a whole lot more conservative. Food for thought.
Yeah.
You got anything?
No, sir. Thank y'all.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.